3 tips for training the next generation of teachers. Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox, and thanks for joining me today on Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 125. And today we're talking about not so much what's coming next as who is coming next. Now, part of my role is to preach and teach, and part of it is to train and mentor other preachers and teachers. And this is particularly on my mind because of something that happened yesterday, Sunday. I'm recording this on a Monday. On the Sunday, I went in the afternoon to a special celebration. Friends of ours, Adrian and Maureen, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Wonderful occasion. We sat on a table along with Katie, one of their daughters, and Katie asked me a penetrating and intelligent question. When I described to her what I was doing these days in terms of preaching, mentoring and training other preachers and teachers, and she asked me this very intelligent question, which you can expect if you know Katie. And thank you for Katie for asking this question, because it helped clarify some things in my mind. She asked me, in view of the fact that I not only preach and teach, but have to let other people step up to preach and teach more than I used to in the past as I mentor and train them, she asked me the question as to whether that was hard. Is it hard to let others step into the space that I have been used to inhabiting? I do still preach and teach, but not as much as I used to. More and more it's younger people. And she asked me that question. Is it difficult? And of course, in some ways it is. It is hard, partly because I enjoy preaching and teaching, but partly also, well, for some reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. But it reminded me that it's so important for me, and it's important for you, whether you consider yourself to be a new and inexperienced speaker or a mature and older speaker like myself. I'm in my 50s, and I'm looking at this next generation because I know that eventually my voice will wear out or my body is going to wear out. But even if you're a younger speaker, even if you're in your 20s, I would suggest you also need to be thinking about that next generation. Some of the best training I ever received was from people who weren't much older than me when I was in my early 20s. That next generation is available to be taught and trained even now, even around you, whatever age you are. There are some people that can benefit from your experience. The key thing, before we talk about the 3 tips, is the attitude. I love the attitude that it describes John the Baptist having when he's questioned. And he says this in John chapter 3, verses 29 and 30. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater. I must become less. And the context there is a little bit different from the things we're talking about, but the principle applies. That there comes a time when we must recognize that we must become less so that others can become greater. The attitude of wanting others to succeed, for their voice to be heard, is very important. So how do we do this? Well, let's take 3 tips from the Apostle Paul. I don't think we can do much better than that. He was a master trainer and mentorer of younger people and other people. So let's have a look at 3 things from his life and see what we can learn for ourselves. So the first thing we need to attend to as we keep an eye on the future is this. Are you willing to work with people long term? Working with people long term, persevering with them, is part of the key of providing the training for the next generation. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, he talks about John Mark. He says, "Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry." Now, if you know anything about John Mark, you'll know that he deserted Paul at one point, and Barnabas took him aside, and it looks like Barnabas helped him work through a difficult time. And then later on we find that Mark has changed. Paul has confidence in him, but when he didn't at that point in the book of Acts, you can read up on that. He has confidence, and he says, bring him with you, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. Barnabas didn't give up, and in a sense Paul didn't give up, although it wasn't the right time for John Mark to continue with Paul at that point. Nonetheless, later it was the right time, and he persevered in training that young man. Have you given up on people? Sometimes they let us down. Sometimes we give people responsibilities they're not ready for, and not only are they not ready, but they don't approach those responsibilities in terms of speaking and preaching with the right spirit. Do we persevere? We've got to persevere. Sometimes it's going to take you more than a month or two, more than a year or two to prepare people for the works of service that God has in mind for them in preaching and teaching. It might take 5 years. It might take 10 years. It might take a very long time. Are you willing to persevere? That's tip number one if we're going to see this next generation come to fruition. Tip number two is, are you taking risks? Are you taking risks, or rather perhaps allowing the people that you are training to take some risks? In Titus chapter 1 verse 5, Paul writes to Titus and he says, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." Now, it seems to me that it would be safer for Paul to travel there and appoint the elders himself, but he's allowing Titus to do it. He's delegating that responsibility to Titus, and I guess Titus is ready, but still, that's an incredibly significant responsibility to give someone, to appoint elders in every town. This work is unfinished. Let's get it finished, Titus. He's taking some risks. It's so important, if we are going to train and mentor the next generation of preachers and speakers, that we take some risks. Sometimes people need to be allowed to be put up there and speak and preach when they're not quite ready. In fact, isn't that true for you and I, that we really weren't ready? I remember my first sermon. It was awful. It was an awful experience, to be honest with you. Not only was my sermon awful, but I remember it just being something that terrified me. And more than that, I felt that I hadn't done a good job. I felt I'd let the church down. I felt I let God down. And it was a rough experience. And I can't blame the people preparing me so much as the fact that I didn't prepare properly myself. But we've got to take risks. And even though that was, in my memory, a negative experience, it was part of the formative experiences that I needed to prepare me to be a speaker and preacher in the years to come. We've got to take some risks. Even if people occasionally say something for which we might need to issue a correction, then that's okay. From now and again, if someone's week after week after week saying things which are damaging, then we should hold off and train them some more. But if we're afraid of it happening, that's part and parcel of training and mentoring people. Don't let the fear of them making mistakes prevent you from taking the risk, perhaps to your own self-esteem, of allowing them up there when they may make some mistakes. So that's the second thing. Let them make some mistakes. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, if you're training someone, do you have a bond with them? Do you have a bond? We see this in Paul's relationship with many people, but especially Timothy. He says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, when he's writing about Timothy in verse 17. He says, "For this reason, I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church." Now, and not to say that every relationship that we may have in mentoring and teaching and training the next generation is going to be father and son-like, as it was with Paul and Timothy. Not necessarily. But what I'm pointing out here is the bond they had, that Paul is able to talk about Timothy as someone that he loves. He would write about it. This would be read in church, and no one there would contradict it. It would have been known that Paul and Timothy had that bond of love. If we're going to effectively mentor people, it can't just be on the technical level of the practicals of speaking and preaching. It must also be about the heart, because preaching and teaching is more than about the practicals and about the specifics of the details of how we do our presentations. It is about the heart. It's about, in fact, about the spirit. It's about our relationship with God. It's about our relationship with truth. It's about our relationship with the world and everything about us. And therefore, a mentoring relationship in preaching and teaching must also include the discipling of the heart, one might say, or the bonding of the heart, which indeed we see with Jesus, of course, and his followers. So 3 things for us to consider today in terms of how we are preparing the next generation. Firstly, are you willing to work with people long term? Secondly, are you willing to take risks in putting them up there? And thirdly, are you developing a true, deep bond with those that God has given you to mentor, to train, to teach, and to preach? I pray that these thoughts have been helpful for you. I would like to know what you think. So please leave a comment anywhere you see this recording. Please leave a comment on the comment box below. Leave it publicly so that we can all learn from one another, because we learn best when we learn in community. Pass the link on to anybody else you think might benefit. hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, let us know what you think, and I'd very much appreciate that. And if you have any suggestions for other topics, then please pop them in the comment box or send me an email, and I'll be very grateful. Thanks so much, and until the next time, I hope you have a terrific Tuesday and a wonderful week. Take care, and God bless.